When you came into the prison and you heard the electronic bolt go into the gate, you really knew you were locked in.
That's Mark Setright, back in 1990, giving historian Mark Youngie a tour of Wyoming's frontier prison in Rawlins, Wyoming. Today, Rawlins remains the site of the only maximum security prison in the state, but that facility is south of Interstate 80, and from a distance, you could even say that it sort of looks like a college with lots of barbed wire.
This was, when they closed the prison, considered some of the hardest time in the country, one of the most dangerous prisons in the country, dangerous both for guards and for prisoners.
The old pen north of the interstate where Mark and Mark are recording actually looks like a soul-crushing prison.
There's a memo from the warden telling Tower 7 guards, stop shooting at the prisoners on the way to the exercise yard.
It has high stone walls, and every window has bars, and its front door has so many bars on it, it looks like a portcullis from a castle.
Drugs, knives, all the stuff they didn't want to get caught with in their cells. They'd hide behind the loose mortar and the holes in the wall.
The old pen's interior walls surround several stories of barred-off cells that have tiny little toilets and hard-looking beds, and they stretch out in long cell blocks.
The ball and chain was used as weight in hangings.
All the paint is peeling, and the whole thing just looks old and dirty and run down.
I remember coming through the prison when I was in 5th grade as a little kid. Scariest guys I've ever seen were sitting at the back of the library in A block. These guys scared me to death. You could tell they didn't like little kids coming through on tours, and I don't blame them.
Apparently, despite being the site of 14 executions, murders, assaults, thefts, untimely deaths, and all kinds of misery, people in Rawlins and across Wyoming still sent their kids into the old pen when it was an active prison.
I remember as kids going through here on tours, they were always warning the girls in the group not to be shocked or offended. And of course, the prisoners weren't to do anything that was offensive while we were walking through as little kids on tours. But they kind of warned us ahead of time.
That's one of the many, many, many odd things about this prison, built in 1901 and not closed until the 1980s. It's only about 6 blocks away from Rawlins downtown, so interactions between prisoners and townspeople happen more than at other prisons.
Yeah, they used to blow the siren off if an inmate was missing or something to that effect.
That's another Rawlins local named Damon Haynes.
No, I couldn't even tell you how many times it actually went off, but it did go off a couple times, and we were to stay inside our houses.
One of the more poignant examples of the crossover between life behind the walls and the rest of the little town of Rawlins happened to someone Mark Setright knew when he was very young.
In 1975, my school bus driver was a guard here at the prison. He went up these stairs by himself, which was pretty unheard of. The inmates first hit him with pool cues, stabbed him 14 times.
On this episode of That Doesn't Happen Every Day, in which we interview everyday people about things that don't normally happen every day, we return to the old penitentiary in Rawlins to examine the horror, violence, and sometimes just surreal stuff that doesn't happen in a small town, unless it's home to a prison.
When someone walked into the prison, even if it was a new guard or something, the prisoners would chant, fish, 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 fish.
I was fortunate that when I first went to the old pen, the prisoners had left it behind about 20 years before. Unlike the other old prison I'd visited in Laramie, Wyoming, which had been scrubbed down and Disneyfied, Rawlins' old pen had that ghost town feel of the prisoners just walking out and leaving behind graffiti and an unsettling presence. Our first stop on my tour, and on the one that Mark is giving to Mark, was a wooden pillar just inside the intake area.
The post in the center was used as a whipping post. Handcuff inmates to this pole and beat them in this room. The architect mentions in his original plans that the other prisoners could hear the beatings going on from this room, act as a deterrent. Officially, the state was allowed to use corporal punishment on incorrigibles until 1930. Unofficially, I've had inmates through here on tours tell me they're still beating people in here in the 60s. It's strictly unofficial.
And that's pretty much the way it was explained to us right after we walked in. It's almost as if the true horror of what happened in the old pen wasn't prepped or set up for us the right way. So it just seems so surreal and odd to have been happening in this peaceful little Wyoming town.
Another thing that made this prison so dangerous is that you mixed maximum, medium, and minimum security all in the same building. You could have 300 inmates out of their cells at the same time in this prison. The white stuff on the walls was toothpaste. They used toothpaste to hang their pictures on the walls. Couldn't get glue or tape.
I remember seeing a pentagram on one of the walls of one of the cells, and as a kid, that really scared me. Mark finds more prisoner graffiti, this with a particular inmate's own interpretation of the cartoon character Snidely Whiplash. He was the mustachioed villain in the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoons who always tied women to railroad tracks.
Snidely Whiplash.
Yeah. It looks like two barrels of a shotgun pointing at a pig on this one. The cardboard on some of the cells is for privacy. The last two wardens let the prisoners put cardboard and strings, curtains on their cells. They had to leave an opening, see them in their beds, open and stick their hands through for count.
The image of a bunch of hands sticking out of tiny slots of the cells to be counted, well, who knew what was really going on in the dark behind them, is freaky, but then things get worse.
Had a former inmate through on a tour tell me that when they call for lockdown, you put a spoon in here to keep your door from closing. Then he said you could run around at night. This guy said it like he ran around a lot of nights in here.
The idea of thinking that you are now safely locked inside your cell, but someone who might have done all kinds of horrible things is now wandering around within reach of your bunk in the dark, unsupervised, while you sleep, is to say the least unsettling. The ability for someone to get out of their cells goes from scary to absurd with the next thing Mark shares.
There's a story about a prisoner named Lindsay the Ferret. He'd be missing for a couple days, and finally he'd turn up back in the prison population. He wasn't leaving the prison. He was just getting between the cells and the passageways and the tunnels.
If an entire living person could hide within the prison walls, what else could you hide?
There was no original heating in this prison. They put a heating system in. They tried borrowing pot-bellied stoves. They said it was only 20 degrees warmer in the cell house than it was outside. 40 below outside, it was 20 below in here.
The lowest ever recorded temperature in Rawlins was 36 degrees below zero in 1911, so you can imagine what it felt like inside the pen.
They went to the steam heat in 1922, and a big improvement, but it's interesting they were still using the same steam heat in 1981.
It's argued that low temperatures and all those hiding places for contraband led to the showers being one of the most violent places in the prison.
They had hot water in the showers, so the inmates were spending too much time in there. They had 9 inmates killed in the shower area between 1978 and 1981.
C.J. Young, who you've heard from before on the podcast, was also a tour guide for the prison and shares what he felt whenever he had to go near the shower area.
The vast majority of us always felt uncomfortable in that area. Even people that were skeptics about ghosts admitted the shower room made them feel uncomfortable to be in there, the atmosphere, the aura of the place.
If you want to hear an episode just of ghost and scary stories from the old pen, you can check out the link in the episode titled Teenage Tours of an Old Prison.
And Noah Richardson, they said he was a little crazy. He'd develop a peculiar homicidal mania or he'd get religious. Lorenzo Passio, while in prison, cut the heart out of another prisoner.
Wait, what? Lorenzo Passio had killed a man in Lovell, Wyoming around 1910. In spite of having a sentence for that crime commuted, Passio nearly disemboweled an inmate named Henry Featherstone with a shoe knife.
He was pushing another guy at the top tier cells. He was usually in the dungeon.
I couldn't actually find anything about Passio cutting out anybody's heart, but apparently when he wasn't disemboweling his fellow inmates, he was involved in one of the biggest prison escapes Rawlins would ever see back in 1912.
28 inmates got loose. They went into town. The townspeople, they were shooting at strangers on the street, whether they're prisoners or not.
Just to clarify, that siren you hear in the background just happened to go off and be recorded. I didn't add it for dramatic effect or anything.
Newspapers around the country said that all the prisoners were loose in the Wyoming State Penitentiary. It wasn't that bad.
The 1912 escape involved about 28 prisoners who fled the prison in 2 different waves. The first group of prisoners broke through a wooden wall around the prison, and then the second group was able to overpower a guard and take his keys, while all or most of the other guards were off looking for the other inmates who'd escaped before.
They killed the local barber. They stabbed another guy at the livery stable. They were stealing clothes of all the clotheslines all over town.
The name of the barber was Charles Stressner, who took a shotgun and tried to stop the marauding inmates, but was apparently shot by escapee Noah Richardson. News articles soon after the event showed his widow petitioning the state of Wyoming for compensation. I'm not sure if she was given it or not.
Lorenzo Passio was shot and killed in front of our newspaper office. And Noah Richardson, there's a picture of him with his head shot off. He's killed at Powder Wash, 65 miles south of town.
The violence ended with armed citizens encircling the prison to stop further escapes, and other citizens and law enforcement tracking escapees in the hills.
But it's bad enough that the governor came to Rawlins, and to calm down the citizens, he ordered the outside wall built around the prison.
Just to clarify, the governor was ordering a better wall than the wooden one that existed at the time. About 10 days before the prison break, Frank Wigfall, an African-American man, was captured after being accused of breaking into the home of a Rawlins local named Esther Higgins and assaulting her.
She was always bringing cakes and cookies to the prisoners, so they called her the prisoner's friend.
News articles said she crawled to a neighbor for help, and a manhunt ensued. Wigfall was captured near Fort Steele, Wyoming, and taken to a jail, but a mob started to form outside the jail, so Wigfall was taken to the big pen for his own protection. Frank had actually been in the old pen in Rawlins and released twice before, once for stabbing a man in Cheyenne in 1901, and once again after confessing to the attempted rape of a 12-year-old girl in Laramie.
They put him in the fourth tier. The inmates took the keys from the guards, locked the guard in a cell, went up to the fourth tier, put the rope around Frank Wigfall's neck. Wigfall was begging to say a prayer. The prisoners told Frank Wigfall that if his prayer was short enough, he'd have time to say it on the way down. No mercy, just threw him right off. He grabbed the railing on the tier below, they pulled him to the top, they dropped him the entire distance again, and the second time he was certainly dead.
Given that Frank Wigfall never even had any kind of trial regarding Miss Higgins' assault, it's unclear if he was involved or not. The 1912 lynching of Frank Wigfall and the massive prison break that followed that were both preceded by attempts at arson. Several times, inmates had tried to burn down the on-site broom factory where they worked. Then, before the final attempt to destroy it, the fire hoses at the prison had been slit, forcing the Rawlins Fire Department to come try to help put out the blaze. According to one news article, inmates watched the factory burn, howling with fiendish glee. Although at the same time, 5 to 10 inmates helped put out the blaze and had their sentences commuted, reduced, or were granted parole. Before the eventual fire, there was one group of broom makers that went on strike, and they were sent to the hole, which was probably the prison's infamous dungeon.
They had prisoners bitten by rattlesnakes in the dungeon. They had prisoners freeze to death in the dungeon. In 1911, when 2 guys died of exposure, the warden's only excuse, the Board of Charities and Reform, in a letter he wrote, was that it got colder than expected. He just couldn't do anything about it.
About 4 decades after the lynching and the big prison break, the old pen would experience its most well-known incident of unrest and chaos, but this time within its own walls.
The riot in 1955, the 100 inmates held 4 guards hostage for 2 days. B block is pretty much what they controlled, and they controlled the cafeteria from here.
Kirk Knox was a reporter at the time and said he went into the prison during the riot.
Some other people from news and I went in there with Millward Simpson, who was then governor, with a half a dozen highway patrolmen, a couple of them with submachine guns and the others with rifles or something, to negotiate with the delegation from the prisoners. And this went on too long for the rest of the prisoners. They start banging with their metal utensils on the bars. Pretty eerie sound, I'll tell you.
A newspaper photo taken after the riot shows an aged, tired guard being hugged by his family after the ordeal.
Their negotiated demands were that there be an investigation for treatment of prisoners in the prison, and there was, and people said things improved after 1955.
One of the other notable events from the old pen that is almost cartoonish in nature actually started in the prison's death house.
In 1959, there was a door to the hanging room, and they were able to pick the lock on the door to the hanging room. They found a way through the trap door. Down below, a tool shed was just what they needed. They got shovels, and they dug a tunnel all the way to the west wall. Now, the official prison records and the newspaper accounts estimate they worked in this tunnel for at least a month and a half. 3 feet deep, 36 inches around, 50 feet to the wall. Where were they putting all this dirt? 2 guys working up here were tearing out pieces of the tin ceiling and spreading the dirt out onto the ceiling here. See where it's sagging back here? Mm-hmm. The dirt is still up here from 1959.
So what happened to these guys attempting a reenactment of The Great Escape?
They made it, except the wall goes 10 feet into the ground, so they had to dig deeper to get it under the base of the wall. And in the process of doing that, they hit something hard. They weren't sure what they're hitting. They hit it over and over. They lit a match to find out. They'd been hitting a gas main. The guards never heard an explosion, but they said the ground was rolling like an earthquake. One guy was pretty badly burned. They took him to the hospital. They were put up here because they were escape artists. Later escaped from 2 other prisons, I think one in Nebraska, and I don't remember now where the other one was.
You hear about prodigies sometimes being in prisons, from the Birdman of Alcatraz to the fictional slideshow Bob. Apparently the pen had one in the form of John McDaniels.
And he suffered, he's a genius. He suffered from severe migraine headaches, but worked calculus problems in his head constantly to keep busy. He could make bombs from matches. He could make knives from paper clips. Daniel could glance at a key, memorize the pattern, and make a key that fit the lock. One time, they found him sitting in his cell here sharpening a kitchen butcher knife. He wasn't trying to hide the knife. He was trying to show the guards he'd been to the kitchen, been to the lock knife case, and locked himself back up. and nobody saw him do it. They'd ask him how to do it and say it's your job to find out. Another time they found his cell empty. They searched the whole prison. They put an escape alert around the state. After searching 12 hours, they assumed he was gone, but they finally found McDaniel sitting inside the warden's office. Said he had a few complaints for the warden. To this day, nobody knows how he got there. But my dad tells another story about one time they couldn't get into the safe, the Green Mill Bar. They took McDaniel down there and had it open in a couple minutes. Everybody's patting him on the back. Way to go, McDaniel.
The thing that bothers me about McDaniel, and probably bothers you too, is that if he can do all those things with all of those limitations, what could he have done on the outside? Remember how Mark said his bus driver was assaulted in the old pen? He takes us to the room where 42-year-old Lieutenant Orville Bentley was attacked.
We ordinarily don't go up here on tours. They had an indoor recreation area, pool tables, game rooms, backgammon here, another table over there. Orville Bentley was walking down the third floor, checking the inmates for the Vitalis they've been drinking. He was shaking them down. And that's one of the reasons the inmates hated him.
Apparently some inmates would drink Vitalis hair tonic for the alcohol. Another article said it was aftershave mixed with soda. At any rate, Orville Bentley went into the rec room where about 15 inmates were.
They actually hit him here. First hit him with pool cues, stabbed him 14 times. His body was thrown over the stairs where there's no railing. He was my school bus driver. I thought he was a great guy.
Both men involved in the killing were caught, and at least one was convicted.
The warden at the time ordered metal plates welded on these doors, and nobody went up there again.
Even though the rec room was sealed shut, prisoners still had outdoor recreation. According to Mark, football wasn't allowed, but the prison baseball team really did shine some years, though it faced challenges most baseball teams don't.
Some of the prison teams beat every town team in the state. There's old Joe Sang playing right field, playing catcher. Best hitter on the team, 4 hits every game, no, without a doubt. Then the following year, the year they hanged Joe Sang, the prison baseball team never won a game.
I know that sounds like the punchline to a bad joke, but sure enough, a 1912 article talking about Joe Sang's upcoming execution date said that arrangements may be made for the vacation of some corridor or apartment in order to get a room for the construction of gallows. Before Sang's death date, and long before prisoners would attempt to tunnel from the floor of the death house, the prison didn't have a death house or any official way to execute anyone. Mark takes Mark over to the death house.
All that's left of the Julian gallows is the little pulley that held the trap door closed.
The Julian gallows used to hang prisoners in this room isn't there anymore. Unlike some gallows that dropped condemned people when the hangman pulled a lever, James Julian, a Wyoming architect, invented a gallows in which the prisoner was ordered to stand on a trapdoor and then water would start to drain out of a bucket. They have a model of it in the prison museum. Which as it started to drain and got lighter and lighter, the weights on this side got heavier, the weights went down, the bucket went up. It was strange, though, because the man stood on there for about a minute and a half listening to sound of water go out of the bucket before it finally fell open. That was it. The idea was that it made everyone less culpable because no one actually pulled a lever. 5 of the 9 hanged here died of strangulation rather than having their neck broke. The last hanging was in 1933, Talton Taylor. His grandkids were here on a tour and wanted all the information about it. Cleveland Brown's nephew was here on a tour and wanted information about him. It's kind of interesting. In 1937, Wyoming adopted a new means of capital punishment.
That's the door to the gas chamber.
The first time I saw the gas chamber at the old pen, I was surprised how small it was and how, unlike some tourist attractions I'd visited where everything is played up and designed to catch your attention or is prefaced or segued, the gas chamber was all of a sudden just sort of there. It sort of looked like the overgrown pressure cooker my grandma had. I remember even sort of wondering, is this real? And then the other people in the tour group began to sit in the gas chamber's metal chair and take each other's pictures. Mark explains one of the cultural views about why so many states went from hangings to using the gas chamber.
This was something scientific that the state did, where hanging is something that a mob group would do down at the railroad tracks. They asked them for a statement, and some of them pronounced their innocence, some of them said a prayer, may God have mercy on me. And the leather straps are for muscle contractions. The stethoscope was hooked to the prisoner with a little pin.
I remember how you could still see the crude little hole drilled into the gas chamber where the cords of the stethoscope led out to the doctors as they listened for a heartbeat.
Drop this lever. Cheesecloth bag full of cyanide pellets fell in the ashes below the chair. Victims' family members were occasionally invited, and the prisoner could invite up to 10 witnesses of their choice. Andrew Pixley had the most ministers, maybe 4 ministers. He's praying constantly right at the time of the execution.
At the time of this recording, there's been one more execution in Wyoming back in 1992 by lethal injection. However, Andrew Pixley was the last person executed in the state by gas in 1965. A family from Illinois was visiting Wyoming the year before and found Pixley with the battered remains of their 12 and 8-year-old daughters in the family's hotel room. The girl's father grabbed Pixley and pinned him to the floor until he could be arrested.
Andrew Pixley wasn't pronounced dead in the gas chamber for 5.5 minutes. I have no idea why he lived almost 3 minutes longer than anybody else in the gas chamber. I'm convinced there was something evil about this guy. There's something demonic. I'm not kidding you.
There's something creepy about the photos of Andrew Pixley on display in the gas chamber. I've looked at him on my computer too, so I don't think it's just the unsettling atmosphere where they're displayed. He sort of looks like Anthony Perkins in Psycho. Thin, dark, young. However, in Psycho, Anthony Perkins' eyes look haunted or malevolent, or at best mischievous. The creepy thing about Pixley's eyes is their complete lack of anything. He doesn't look angry or afraid. He doesn't look like he's trying to be tough or appear remorseful. They're like 2 open black windows on a blank face.
I was up here late. It was not dark, but getting kind of dark. But my flashlight happened to catch his eyes, the photograph in the hanging room there. And as I looked at his eyes, I thought to myself, boy, that guy has really strange eyes. And as I thought that, I heard 2 little girls crying behind me in the hanging room. My heart leapt, my hair standing up for me, and I'm running to the front door thinking that I was haunted or something. I opened the front door, 50 feet over the other side of the wall was a volleyball area. These kids were playing volleyball, and it was getting late. They were fighting. The sound of crying when the wind's blowing comes right over the wall into the hanging room, like it's right there. The boy sits there, I don't come up here at night.
According to a news article, Pixley had requested for his eyes to be removed and donated to the University of Colorado for study and for possible transplant. The idea of someone wandering around out there looking through Andrew Pixley's creepy eyes is too much. Maybe the strangest story from the prison was that of Jim Best.
He was paroled from the prison. At that time, what they did is they gave a prisoner a sack of lunch and a little money, and he went out and ate his sack of lunch on the front lawn of the prison. He came back to the front gate and said he couldn't take it out here. Let me back in. The guard said, no, wait, you're free to go. Jim Best said he'll be right back. And the guard knew what he meant, knew that he was going to go do something to get right back in prison. So the guard said, wait a minute. They called Cheyenne, and they got special permission to keep Jim Best in prison, and then he just lived out his life as buried in the prison cemetery.
One of the other weird things about Wyoming's frontier prison is just how Wyoming it is. A 1983 news article that revisits that killing of Orville Ventling includes graphic details about the stabbing, clubbing, and even how one inmate pleaded for Ventling not to die. And then right away in the next paragraph starts with the sentence, "Those who would like to tour the prison may contact the Rawlins Park and Rec Department," followed by phone numbers and contact information. I can't think of anything more Wyoming than the fact that the same place where Mark's school bus driver was murdered and he was stared down as a child by angry convicts, and where inmates often helped and sometimes hurt the very community he grew up in, is also now where Mark makes a living.
Did you ever think as a kid, Mark, that you would be doing this?
Never. In fact, I have a hard time imagining that I'm doing it now.
I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of That Doesn't Happen Every Day. Mark Setright is no longer with us, but I would like to thank him and thank all of his relatives. If they hear this, I hope they enjoy this. I want to make sure to thank Mark Youngie, who recorded this interview with Mark Setright. If you really enjoyed this episode, please stay tuned because there's actually 2 more episodes I plan to do that relate to the prison. One episode will be about how in the mid-1980s, a movie production company came in and made a movie called Prison in the old prison, and we interview lots of local people from Rawlins about their part in that film as extras and grips and in other ways. In the other prison-related episode, we have an interview with a professional photographer who also took her picture in the gas chamber and at many other spots on the prison grounds, and how she produced and why she produced the creepy images she did during that shoot. If you would like to visit the Wyoming Frontier Prison, I've linked their website in the description, and there you can find out their times, fees, everything. By the way, I don't know if they still are under Rawlins Parks and Rec, so please be advised that whoever was administrating the site in 1983 might not still be the same organization. If you've enjoyed this episode of That Doesn't Happen Every Day, please do a search for That Doesn't Happen Every Day. Every day is 2 words in this case, podcast, and you can listen to every past episode I've done completely for free. Thank you for listening and have a good day.